Marisha here, and I'm doing a bit of a departure from talking about London, life in the UK, to talk about what's going on in the States. Specifically to talk about Elon Musk and Doge ransacking government agencies and organizations and essentially trying to dismantle them. And the impetus for this video is that on Friday, they entered the offices of the Peace Corps. And that's personal to me because I was a Peace Corps volunteer from 2010 to 2012 in the country of Turkmenistan. And I think that, I know that based on my conversation with people, a lot of people are not aware of what the Peace Corps is. Those who are aware that it exists, I think, often have not the clearest idea of what we actually do and what our purpose is. They tend to stereotype Peace Corps volunteers as hippies, or today I guess they would call us woke, because, yeah, if you're going to give up 2 years of your life to live in poverty in a developing country and donate your time and your skills to helping those people, yeah, I guess the right wing would consider that woke. Um, Normal people would consider it empathetic, but you know, but the Peace Corps is not just, it's not entirely altruistic. Um, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about its history and what its purpose is and why it's important that we maintain it. So the Peace Corps started kind of in my home state of Michigan when JFK gave a speech at the University of Michigan and ask the students there, how many of you would be willing to, like, how many of you who are training to be doctors would be willing to go practice in Ghana? How many of you would be willing to travel the world in service of your country, and service of other people? And that idea sort of became the germination of what became the Peace Corps. Within a year, he had asked Sergeant Shriver to kind of write up the what it would look like, and it was passed into law in 1961, and the first group of volunteers were sent out. And Peace Corps has three goals. The first one is to help people in other countries, and by help them, it can be in a lot of different sectors. So, Peace Corps volunteers range from teaching English as a second language to doing medical care, agriculture, forestry, business, all sorts of different sectors where volunteers go and they help teach people new skills, educate people, do AIDS education, all sorts of things. The second goal is to teach people in other countries about America, because otherwise they think that we are like what they see in the movies or what they see in the media, and that's not an accurate portrayal of what the average American is like. A lot of people in a lot of countries think that Americans are all like blonde-haired, blue-eyed Texans, and they're honestly surprised when a Peace Corps volunteer of color comes to town. And it's harder for Peace Corps volunteers of color because people in other countries will ask them, like, no, where are you really from? Right? Because they think that everybody in America is white. And we know that that's not true. And so that's just one example of how just interacting with people in other countries can help build a better understanding of what America is like. Other things are, for example, I had an America Club where I just taught my students, here's some aspects of American culture. Here's some of the holidays that we celebrate. Um, and I remember having a conversation, for example, with one of my students who, again, I was serving in Turkmenistan, which is a dictatorship. It is isolationist. And if you want to know what America will look like, 1 or 2 years down the road, if we don't put a stop to what Trump and Musk are doing, you can look at Turkmenistan. One of my students said to me, oh, I was watching on the news and some reporter said something like, oh, if Obama doesn't do this, then blah, 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 right? Basically talking about, she'd seen basically like a political pundit or something. But she said, if one of our reporters said that about our president, like he would disappear, right? So we're able to have that conversation openly, and I can kind of talk about, like, yeah, this is what it's like in America, and no, you wouldn't get arrested for saying this or doing this. Um, And then the third goal is to teach Americans about the countries in which we serve, because Americans are shamefully ill informed about the rest of the world. And the more we can do to help inform Americans about the rest of the world, and also just generally how international diplomacy and international economics work. I mean, what could be more timely when we're talking about tariffs and just the nonsense that Trump is doing, with no understanding of how international economics and relations work. Um, and part of the Peace Corps third goal is they have a program where volunteers are matched with schools. And they talk to students and they answer student questions about other countries. And can you imagine what a great resource that is for your kids to be able to talk to someone who lives in that other country, not not as an expat, not vacationing there, but lives with a host family, learned the language, works in the community, is like fully there, um, to be able to answer questions about that country and to have that sort of resource available to them. So I did that with one of the classes at the school where I had been teaching before I left in Nevada. And so we exchanged emails a few times, and kids asked me questions and I answered them. And then when I got back, I actually drove out to Nevada and gave a presentation to them. I also gave a presentation to some kids in Michigan because I had contacts with um, the teacher who had been my teacher mentor during student teaching. And I also gave a presentation to the community at a public library. So Peace Corps volunteers are doing that when they come back. Their service doesn't end when they get back to the States. They're often kind of trying to fulfill the third goal as well. And if you'll notice, the second and third goals are all about diplomacy. And that really is the most important thing about the Peace Corps, is that it is grassroots diplomacy. And for that reason, it's actually very important to national security. Um, for one thing, there are political leaders around the world now who, when they were little, were exposed to Peace Corps volunteers. They learned English from them, or they learned better farming practices from them, or whatever. And that built a positive idea of what America and Americans are like. And now those people are grown up, they're in positions of power in their country, and that's really important when we're talking about international diplomacy. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the Peace Corps was born out of Cold War politics. Kennedy recognized that the Russians had plenty of engineers, scientists, teachers, doctors who were willing to live in other countries to help spread the ideology of communism. And Kennedy realized America needs something where we are doing the same to spread the ideals of democracy. And that is absolutely, I mean, volunteers are not trained to go like preach democracy. We're trained to go do the first goal, right? To teach people English as a second language, or to help people start up micro businesses, or to educate people about HIV, AIDS, or whatever. But a natural result of just being an American and going and living in another country and developing relationships with people where you are able to have conversations, like real conversations about what's life like there, versus what's life like here, and what are some of the comparisons. You are naturally going to be talking about some of the merits of living in a democracy, living in a country that has more gender equality. That was another big thing that came up a lot when I was overseas, is and not even always explicitly, but sometimes just the fact that I was a confident woman who traveled on my own, who went to go live in another country on my own. The girls and women that I had contact with, that to them, that was just not on the table. Like they never would have considered that. But because they're being exposed to female volunteers who are like strong, independent women and are out on this adventure on their own. They're not being controlled by a husband or whatever. They see that as an example, and it starts to get them thinking about, okay, well, what kind of life do I want for myself? Or why is that not an option for me here? Right? And you don't realize the seeds that are planted through those personal relationships that volunteers build with with people in their community. Um, Another thing I mentioned, for example, in terms of like national security, I mentioned, for example, that Peace Corps volunteers have done a lot in terms of HIV/AIDS education. And whenever you're talking about disease, that's not something that is, just stays in one country. And we learned that during COVID, how quickly disease can spread. And that when any place is suffering from an outbreak of something, it can become a problem for everyone, right? And so, especially, you know, a decade or two ago, when we had like an AIDS epidemic and before there was medication available, like they've done wonders with medication and stuff now. But there's a lot of misinformation about AIDS and HIV, including even today. There are places, remote places in the world where people still are very misinformed. And one example is in some places, there's this belief that if a guy has AIDS and he sleeps with a virgin, then he'll be cured of it. And so that they end up, raping young girls for that. And so, on a human level, on a human rights level, um, the the work that the Peace Corps can do around educating people about AIDS is critical. But even if you are someone who just does not care about other people, right? I'm talking to people who are like right wing and think that, well, why do we need to care about other people in other countries? We need to take care of our own or whatever. In a more cynical response to that, in a more practical response, is because they're it doesn't stay there, right? Diseases spread. Um, and additionally, with international aid, that is again a form of defense, of national security, right? Because if we give money and aid to a country, that builds good, positive relationships with them. If we don't, someone else can step in. Russia or China can step in with aid. And then that country's allegiance is to them. And I'm not going to go into the whole like explanation of it, but that should be enough to get you thinking. If you're one of those people who honestly believes that we shouldn't be giving foreign aid because we need to, quote, take care of our own, as though the two are mutually exclusive, understand that giving foreign aid is actually a form of also taking care of our own. So the Peace Corps does really great work. It's been around for 60 years now. Over 200,000 Americans have volunteered as Peace Corps volunteers. Uh, Combined, Peace Corps volunteers speak over 200 languages. So it's also a program that helps train people for work after the Peace Corps. Think about how important it is that we have people who can speak other languages, again, for national security. And I'm leaning heavily on the national security thing because the people who need to be convinced about the importance of the Peace Corps are people who don't care about human beings, right? Obviously, what I like about the Peace Corps and why I was drawn to the Peace Corps is empathy and being able to help other people. But I think that people who share my view on that don't need to be convinced about why we should still have the Peace Corps. Um, that's why I'm leaning heavily on the security issue. Um, Peace Corps is actually a really difficult assignment. It's difficult to get in. Only about 23% of applicants, so less than a quarter of applicants, get offered a position. So it's highly competitive. And then you can imagine it's an incredibly difficult job because you are going to live in a developing country for 2 years, really 27 months. You are not around any family or friends. It's a completely different culture. You're learning a new language, even if it's a country that generally speaks a language that you might know, right? If it's a South American country that speaks Spanish or an African country that speaks French, more often than not, as a Peace Corps volunteer, you will be taught a tribal language to reach specific sectors of the community, because then you're speaking the the language of the people and not like the colonists' language. Um, and that's why there are over 200 languages spoken by Peace Corps volunteers, is because they're often taught, tribal languages. Um, Again, you're living at the level of the people in your community, and so you're given a stipend that's just enough to like cover your housing and food costs. Um, and it's really difficult. It's a huge adjustment. A lot of places, you don't have the amenities of home. Where I lived in Turkmenistan, um, it was, internet was not as accessible as it is in the Western world. Some of my peers couldn't use the internet during the week. They had to go on the weekend to a larger city and go to an internet cafe. Um, was not unusual to have to use facilities that were basically a hole in the ground. Um, there's no McDonald's or any fast food restaurants. There's none of those kind of comforts of home. There's no like real Italian food. There's no like hand dipped ice cream. There's like all of the things that like creature comforts of home that you might be able to find if you were living in like a European country, right? Like, or even a more like a large city in most places in the world. You can usually find like a McDonald's or something when you're feeling really homesick. That wasn't the case, and that's the case for a lot of volunteers. They're living in rural areas, and maybe if they have a break and they can get into the big city once every few months, they can get something that's a little bit like home. But for the most part, it's a steep learning curve, and it's really difficult work. It's why the Peace Corps' slogan is the hardest job you'll ever love. And the Peace Corps really is this incredibly kind of unique thing. When I talk to Brits about the Peace Corps, they recognize that they don't really have an equivalent. Yeah, they have opportunities to volunteer, but it's not the same. It's not as intense as Peace Corps is. Um, it is a gem. It is a fantastic thing that is um, focused on peace. It's focused on diplomacy at the grassroots level, on building relationships, on community development and global development, and it costs the American taxpayer less than $3 a year. Right? The budget for the Peace Corps is like 0.0007% of the national budget. Yeah, it's like $2.81 per year for a taxpayer. And for that, the amount of good work that's being done, not only for people who like me, um, care about Jesus's teachings, or for whatever faith or just general sense of morality that you come from, of caring about other people, it's a great thing. But even for people who don't see that empathy is something we should be striving toward, again, from a national security level and a diplomacy level, it's an important thing as well. So if you're in the States and you were taking part in the protest this weekend and you're someone who is all about calling your senator or writing letters or things like that, please keep Peace Corps on your radar and fight for us to keep that program along with, all of the other ones that are being affected, right? Just fight the good fight. Hopefully next week I'll have something that's a little bit more lighthearted and back to UK. In the meantime, like, subscribe, tell your friends how gnarly this channel is, and I'll see you next time.